Okay, Edward here from earviewer.com. I have a special guest in my home again, Paul Smith, former military remote viewer, an extremely unique individual who had an unbelievable opportunity in life that very few people can claim to. Part of the original remote viewing, military remote viewing program, a handful of people who had this unbelievable opportunity to train in this secretive program with the one and only Ingo Swann, with the great Hal Putoff. And he's a guest in my home again. I'm so happy to have him here. Paul, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, I'm happy to. It's always fun.
Appreciate it when you come into town, stopping by my house.
Well, I like to come over and get reacquainted with your cat. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, they love you, you know. And so we're going to have a little conversation again. And I was hoping that we could talk about one of my favorite topics that I talk about a lot in my videos, an obsession of mine, this area of the mind that in many terms, probably the one that Paul would identify with is the Limen. I call it the threshold barrier, threshold of awareness, a couple different names I throw around. I may be using the wrong words, but that area of the mind that we come up to as we're attempting to receive, or where perceptions and concepts and ideas and mental processes and emotions pop above this Limen and come through in our remote viewing process. But Paul, you understand this area, you have discussed it with Ingo, trained it with Ingo. What is your definition of it and your interpretation of this area that I'm talking about?
Well, first thing, I'm not sure I understand this area. I don't know that anybody actually does. There's a lot of theories, but is there any certainty? No. But based on what I learned from Ingo, okay, the word Limen itself comes from, I believe it's Latin, it might be Greek, I don't remember now. The word that means threshold, as in the threshold of a door, right? And it was applied to this idea of the dividing line between conscious awareness and subconscious or unconscious. You know, we can talk about that wording later, but it's the division between what we access during our waking state when we're not asleep, when we're not unconscious, right, out of it, right, whatever, and the part of us that's all the mental processing that's going on outside of our conscious awareness. Okay, so that's what the liminal threshold or the Limen is, and what it is actually, we don't really know. I mean, it could be unlikely, but it could be an actual barrier between the two that keeps the one from percolating too forcefully into the other, or it could be just like the surface of the ocean. There's no real thing that is the surface of the ocean. It's just that the ocean ends and the air begins. Right. Now, interestingly, in that case,
that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is that if we can even take that analogy a little further, because the surface of the ocean, actually, there isn't a discrete surface, at least at the microscopic level. There is a kind of a boundary zone between where water ends and air begins, where it's kind of the water has permeated the air. So it's sort of a transition area. I mean, it's very tiny, right? But there's a transition area between the water and the air. And it's kind of like that in our conscious states, where you've got the subconscious, unconscious area. You've got the Limen, which is, we could say, the surface of the subconscious, right? And then you've got conscious awareness. And some of what goes on in the subconscious at that boundary area does leak into conscious awareness a little bit. That's where subliminal perception comes from, for example, as they used to call it. That's actually technically an obsolete word, but I still use it because it actually says more to people, I think, generally than the words that they've used to substitute for that. So the Limen in and of itself may not be anything except a frontier zone, perhaps. So anyway, that answers your first question. So
yeah, I mean, the thing about, I mean, if we look at the analogy, it's an interesting analogy of where water and air change or the two things convert. In that we're looking at molecular changes there, and in our minds, it's some different type of force. Like I'm attempting to perceive or conceive of it within myself. And that's what I'm doing with my sessions, is to attempt to go and experience this. It's like a force field of some kind. I mean, maybe it's possibly some kind of electromagnetic force field somehow in our minds or in our brains. that is allowing us to stay pretty focused on our environmental stimulus, but it also is keeping us, in my opinion, kind of my conspiratorial opinion here, but keeping us from the other 99% of the rest of the things that we can conceive or perceive. And so, like some of the comments that I get about my pursuit or my talk about this topic is that, oh well, just meditate and expand your mind, which to me is they obviously don't know what I'm talking about, because in remote viewing, this force field, and I'll call it a force field, or the Limen, obviously on the other side of the Limen is where all of the a complete understanding or the unimpeded input is existing, but trickles of it make it through the Limen. Why do you think that is?
Well, first, I think there's some assumptions here we need to deal with. All right. So, first off, I don't think you can think about the Limen without having a better grasp of the unconscious or subconscious, right? Particularly, that's the case if the Limen isn't any kind of a barrier. It's just the surface, right? So, and this is where the water analogy breaks down, because what's below the surface isn't much different than what's above the surface in the consciousness spectrum. Okay. So, first let's talk about unconscious versus subconscious, that terminology. Sometimes I think it's a distinction without a difference. Sometimes I think it's a difference without a distinction.
Depends on what day or how much caffeine
there's
you have.
this debate about the terminology. Is it subconscious? Is it unconscious? Well, a lot of the psychoanalysts, they use the Freudian terminology where it's unconscious, right? I prefer subconscious, not just because I learned it from Ingo, because I think it's actually more descriptive, in my opinion. It appears to me that generally in psychology and even in philosophy of mind, there's a line drawn between what I call conscious awareness and the subconscious. Conscious awareness is what philosophy and psychology refer to as consciousness. The waking state, when we're awake and we perceive the world and interact with the world, that part of our mental furniture, right? But what they overlook is that the kinds of things that are happening in the subconscious are actually in some ways just as conscious as what happens in the conscious awareness. We just don't have access to that.
Exactly, yeah.
Or at least our conscious awareness doesn't have access to that.
Right.
Now there's a lot of automatic processing that happens in subconscious. We do a lot of things without thinking about it, right, at the conscious level. Like if you're driving down the street and all of a sudden a little kid jumps out of the street, you automatically swerve. You don't even have to think about it. You just do it, right? Well, that's our subconscious taking action. But if you think about what it had to do to cause you to make that sudden move without thinking about it, it had to notice, observe, which is a function of consciousness. It had to observe the image, the visual experience of that child coming out, the information that came from that, like motion, color, location, all those kind of things. And then it had to interpret what it was in reality. It was a kid jumping out of the traffic. And then it had to further come to some conclusions about what to actually do, what action to take. The proper action in that case is to swerve around the kid. All of that is happening at your subconscious level, and it is identical to what would happen at your conscious level if you were given time to do that processing, right? So that tells me the subconscious is just as conscious as the conscious is.
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree.
Yeah. So when I talk about consciousness in my remote viewing classes, and I have a whole block on this. I go into all this stuff. When I talk about, I tell folks, okay, so I don't limit consciousness just to that waking state where science and philosophy these days limit it. To me, consciousness refers to the entire mental content, the mental processing, the mental process that go on in humans, whether we're aware of it or whether it's below the threshold, this threshold, right? So essentially we're fully conscious. What we don't have is direct access to the subconscious.
And what? Yeah, good.
Okay, so, and that's the beauty of remote viewing, is it allows you to have some access to what's going on at the subconscious level that doesn't normally get into conscious awareness. And that's a major part of the remote viewing process, to allow you to have that access.
Right, right. And I think that the important thing is that the pursuit, or what, for me, what makes remote viewing so important to humanity, is that we're attempting to break through that threshold and get into that other part of ourselves. This is, again, a big topic of mine. What was Ingo's, or what do you recall of like Ingo's, what did Ingo think the threshold was, or what was his opinion on that? And even in conversation maybe you had with them, talking about it.
He didn't really go into a lot of detail about it. He pretty much said, you've got conscious awareness, you've got the limen, you've got the subconscious. What you're trying to do is open up the aperture, which is the passageway. He was a little vague on this. At least I remember him as being vague. We're talking 40 some odd years ago now, right?
Yeah.
Where the aperture was. I mean, sometimes he talked as if the aperture, which is I started to say this, the passageway for the information, I guess you could most easily say it, that comes from ESP. Sometimes it was as if the aperture was between the human and the actual signal, right? So in other words, it would be somewhere in your subconscious. And sometimes he talked as if it were in the limen itself, that as it opened up, you had deeper access to the subconscious information. And maybe there's two of them, I don't know.
Right? Right, we don't know.
Yeah, and you have to realize that aperture is kind of a figurative term anyway, because it's not like we have another hole in our head. It's more like an area of permeability, or some kind of portal, if you will, through which information comes. If you think about it, we have a lot of installed filters in our minds anyway. You're just leaving the ESP part of it out. Because literally, I calculated this once, and I know my figures are off somewhat, but I figure there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 11.5 million bits per second of sensory information that comes into and it comes in at our subconscious level. Okay. And of that, roughly 40 to 60 bits. And we're talking such a small fraction that it wouldn't even show up on a graph.
Right.
Tiny bit of information makes it into our conscious awareness, but that information is sufficient, because so much of what comes in sensorially is irrelevant. And if we were flooded, if our conscious awareness was flooded by that information, all the executive functioning you're supposed to do would be totally inundated. It wouldn't be able to work anymore, right? And so we do have these filters for the subconscious material, just normal sensory input. Probably, almost certainly, we have similar filters for the extrasensory input, which is many orders of magnitude larger, presumably. So go ahead.
I was going to say, in your opinion, the reason for even having a limen, what would you say would be the reason for even having one?
Well, I think, and now we're talking evolutionary biology or God, one or the other, right? It was installed at some point in the human race, right?
I agree.
Or maybe even.
See, I said that, people were
pre-human.
like, calling me a freak,
Yeah.
Like, no, I think something placed this on us. Like
Well, but evolutionary biology places things without any conscious intent, right? At least if you follow that particular theory of life and creation. Essentially, those organisms survive that have this filter, right? If you think about it, if we didn't have something like the limen, all of that's happening in the subconscious would essentially flood our conscious awareness, and we become dysfunctional. It'd be almost like being dosed with nerve agent in a way.
I hear exactly what you're saying, but if we didn't have it, we would naturally have adapted to.
Who said you were allowed to disagree with me? Go ahead,
say that again.
Say that again.
If we didn't have one, we would naturally have adapted to not having one. My own personal theory is that the limen might possibly be a combination of mental process, emotional reinforcement, and some kind of electromagnetic field. And the reason I'm thinking that possibility is that it could be a mental construct that we've created in our minds, emotionally reinforced mostly by fear. We're afraid that if we didn't have it, we would be inundated with too much information. We would totally freak out. We would go crazy. So there's an emotional reinforcer. And some kind of possibly, and I may be using the wrong terms, but some type of electromagnetic or some kind of force field. Because when we're attempting to remote view, as an example, we're bringing our awareness to this, what seems to be a barrier of some kind. And and you can speak to your experience with this, but for me, it's kind of like when you take two magnets and you try to put them together, you can feel this almost tangible resistance, or some field you're coming up against. And my other feeling on that too, my other opinion on that is if the Limen was a survival mechanism, then it wouldn't be logical, because if it were lowered, or we would have greater survival capability.
Not necessarily. Not if you had so much extraneous information that it conflicted with your decision-making capability. Then it would be less survivable.
How though? Give me explain.
Well, I have to think of a good example, but let's say it's this way. Okay, so let's say you're out. We're proto-cavemen, not living in caves, but living on the savannah, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're many generations ago. We're out there walking around, and our main interests are avoiding threats and finding opportunities for procreation or for food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are our main concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So we're out there wandering around. If was the case that you were getting the Limen, let's say, was further down in the subconscious, so more was conscious awareness, and we get all the sensory input. And you're going along, and the wind is really loud, and the crickets are chirping, and you're kind of overwhelmed by all these things. There could be a leopard sneaking up on you, and because you have so much of this input going on, you don't notice as clearly that you're under threat at that point. Okay, so it's not a great example, but it kind of gives you the idea that if you don't have filters, you can be inundated by information. It's often the case, actually, even in today's society, where let's take NSA for example.
Okay.
Good example, right? So they're out there hoovering up all of this metadata, and they're hoovering up all the other data they've got, tons and tons. One of their biggest problems was sorting through all that information to find the important stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they had to come up with all kinds of different ways of analyzing it and working with it. It used to be just hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people listening in all this stuff and sorting through it and highlighting it and that stuff. Now, they have essentially machine-generated filters, kind of like a liminal threshold, that allows only the stuff that matters to pop up, because otherwise the whole system is blinded by having too much information. Essentially, that's inconsequential, right?
Yeah.
And our brains are like that as well. Okay, now. The process of control remote viewing, which I teach, seems designed to push the Limen down, but only selectively. Okay, so that you push it down to pick up the kinds of information that you're looking for, and nothing else.
Okay, now we're on to some good parts, because I want to go, because in my opinion, what you're saying now is very important for people who are interested in remote viewing, learning remote viewing, or have some remote viewing training, but this is probably maybe an area where they maybe are confused about. And if you could describe that further, like we were talking about, like Ingo, what you were saying, there was kind of like as an analogy of kind of lowering down the Limen to allow some specific things to surface through, like if you're putting some pad into a water or something like that, only certain particles came through, or something along those lines. But can you describe that further, or explain that a little more?
Okay.
If I didn't totally confuse you, man.
I'm not sure.
I mean,
Are we talking about pushing the Limen down? Is that
Yeah.
Okay. So, and you have to understand that there's some hand waving going on here. Ingo had this model that he explained, which does seem to fit the process somewhat, but is there really something pushed down? Are you really pushing it down, or are you just opening it up? We don't know. It's a way of talking about it, right? And so the way we talk about it in CRV is that the idea is you push the liminal threshold down so that more of the subconscious material can be accessed. But it's done in such a way that it specifies certain information. For example, it doesn't do you any good if you push the liminal threshold down and all of a sudden you become very aware that your pants are rubbing on your legs, right? That doesn't do you any good remote viewing wise at all. What does help if you push down is if you start picking up more sensory experience from the target itself,
right?
So you can learn more about the target. And so that's the goal, and using that as our metaphor or our analogy or whatever you want to call it, it does seem to work that way, right? So as you get deeper into the session, the aperture opens up, the liminal threshold goes down, however you want to look at it. This more selective kind of information starts to come in. You start recording it. Now, The thing is that it doesn't automatically do that. That's part of the learning process. You have to learn to distinguish what is the actual signal information from what isn't, and that's probably 90% of the
Sure.
challenge. Well,
Absolutely.
people ask me oftentimes, well, what is it that you learn in remote viewing? You know, down to the brass tacks, what is it specifically you learn? I say, well, you can break it down into two essential elements. The first one is learning to distinguish the noise from the signal, and the other is learning to recognize the signal itself and know what is signal.
Right.
And no one ever gets that perfectly. But the point of training, followed by a great deal of practice, is that you start to learn to sort out the noise from the signal and then to identify the signal and record it. And that's really the core of remote viewing training. Of course, the devil's always in the details, and there's a huge amount to doing that.
Right.
One of which that's essential is practice, because even you can learn the theory. It's just like any other field. You can learn the theory, you can learn the principles, you can learn the formula,
Right.
how to do it. But ultimately, you have to learn how it feels to do that. You have to learn what the experience is like, and that comes through practice, trial and error. Getting it wrong, getting it right, getting it wrong and right, ultimately getting it right, hopefully, right? So,
Hopefully, yeah. Ideally.
yeah.
Do you think? Because again, this is a topic that I obsess about a lot. This Limen, the idea of it. Do you think that it is something that it is getting compromised? And this as someone who has been in this for 40 years or so. Do you feel that it's being compromised now because of a lot of remote viewing, meaning that more people are doing it, which may be making it easier for people to have these experiences because possibly we are compromising or the limit itself? In my opinion, it's, I want to bash away at it.
There's two ways of using the word compromise. I'm not sure which way you're using it now. Compromise means each side gives a little bit and you come to a mutual agreement. Or compromise.
Soften. We'll go. How about soften?
Compromise can be damaged or weakened. Yeah,
that's kind of weakened. We'll go.
Right.
Yeah, that's really where I'm going with that.
Right. So, I'm not really concerned about the weakened part. So let's go back to something I was going to talk about earlier. Partly the distinction between unconscious and subconscious, and then what though that might be, right? So, well, I've already kind of explained subconscious versus unconscious. I happen to think that unconscious is not unconscious.
I totally agree.
I think that what is referred to as the unconscious is just as conscious, but our conscious awareness just doesn't have access to it.
I totally agree.
So I use subconscious, which in itself isn't the best term either.
Right, I totally agree.
But at least acknowledges some of that. All right, now I lost the thread. Where was I going with that? What it is, what the subconscious is, and the bottom line answer is we don't know. Okay, how it functions can be described in psychology and neuroscience, somewhat in neuroscience, but we don't exactly know what it is. There's a number of theories. One is that the subconscious just is the right hemisphere, the nonverbal hemisphere, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason that we can't, or in our conscious awareness then, is the left hemisphere, right? That's a simplistic thing. I think when we talked before, I acknowledge the hemispheric lateralization. I think is true, but it's oversimplified. Right. But it makes it easier to talk about when we do that. So recognize that there are lots of exceptions you could throw in here, but just make it easy. I'm going to talk about the left is the linguistic side, mm-hmm. and the right is the non-linguistic side, and never the twain shall meet in a certain way, right? Because they operate in somewhat different domains. The left really doesn't access the right very well, at least in terms of comprehension. Mm-hmm. And the right has the same issue with the left. I mean, you see some split brain studies, it's quite interesting, where the right hemisphere is shown incomplete images, right? So, for example, half a house or half a person, right? Mm-hmm. And then when the right hemisphere sketches that with the left hand, right, though it comes through faithfully presented as half of an image. Well, the left brain, when it gets that impression, it can be just shown half an image, but it doesn't leave it that way. The left brain's got to add the other half. It just can't stand the symmetry to be disrupted that way, right? And so it goes and interprets it and interpolates and adds the other half to the thing. So it didn't, it doesn't really know what's happened to the right hemisphere, even in non-split brain patients, in normal patients where the corpus callosum is intact. The left brain has only partial access to what's going on in the right brain, because it isn't set up to translate, right? To experience the thing the same way. And so consequently, the subconscious could be the right hemisphere. And some of the things that the subconscious does seems to be right hemisphere specific, in terms of what traditionally has been considered right hemispheric functioning. Now, some of the things it does is also left hemisphere, and that was where you get into the complexity, because the two hemispheres are interconnected in interesting and useful ways. It's just that some functions seem to be, one hemisphere is preferenced over the other, right?
Right.
So, I don't know, maybe the subconscious is right hemisphere. Maybe the subconscious is just a further, so if you drew human consciousness as everything, conscious awareness and subconscious all together, right? And then drew a line across, which is the model, the diagram I use, right? You draw the model across, or the line across, and you have this model. It may be, and I saw this proposed in one paper I read, that maybe it's just the part of our awareness we don't attend to, right? Whatever your attention goes to becomes non-subconscious anymore, it becomes conscious. Now, there are demonstrably parts of the subconscious, parts is of course another one of those red flag words. What does it mean to be a part of the subconscious, right? But there are parts of our subconscious that we never have access to. And those may be actually further down in what might truly be an unconscious region of the mind. Probably maybe down primitive the brainstem, where reflexes and stuff occur, or wherever that is. So there are parts that could never become conscious. But I am less enthusiastic about that, because we don't seem to be able to intentionally access parts of our subconscious, or pay attention to our subconscious the way that theory would suggest. The theory that it's just a part of our minds that we don't pay attention to. Right. So, I don't know, and there may be other theories out there about it, but I couldn't talk to them right now. I haven't done a systematic look into this as I'd like to.
Because let me ask you this, because I've had experience. One of the things that I love about doing this, why I do it, is that I will have an experience of comprehending something that I wouldn't, to a depth and degree that I wouldn't comprehend if I were just to look at it or read it. And what that does for me when I have experiences like that is that it makes me contemplate this notion that beyond that threshold, beyond that Limen, is the great vastness of our own genius, where we comprehend things in vast depth, and amazing depth. And above the threshold, we have very limited depth. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Where I said that in one of my videos, we're kind of locked in an above threshold state of stupidity, and below that is where a vast genius level of comprehension. And which goes back to my other theory that if that threshold barrier was lowered, so to speak, we would have greater access to that, which would increase our.
This actually comes to a couple of assumptions.
Survivability.
Yeah, this comes to a couple of assumptions I wanted to address and forgot.
The
first one is that the subconscious has unlimited access to the universe. That's an assumption. We don't want that to be true.
It totally is an assumption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does seem to have at least some access to the universe, or a remote viewing couldn't work. But it does work, and so therefore we have some access. But just because we have some doesn't mean we have all. True. So the subconscious is not necessarily all-knowing. Right?
True, but I would say, would you agree with me that that part of ourselves has a far greater understanding and comprehension than the above threshold?
It does, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that, I don't know what the exact percentages are. You can talk to neuroscience, they might be able to tell you. But let's say on the order of 70 to 75% of our mental life, or maybe more, occurs below that threshold. Right. Now, of course, a lot of that stuff is just managing the system, right? All the stuff that happens behind the scenes, the duck paddling furiously underwater, kind of like that. But a lot of our perception, awareness, recognition, all that stuff's happening below the liminal threshold. Even a lot of our decision making happens there. We'll
Pre-conscious processing.
our subconscious will make a decision, and then our conscious awareness makes a decision. And thinking it has made it itself, but it's really been informed by the subconscious, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not all decisions are like that, but there are many. Getting out of the way of the kid in the street. That's a prime example of a decision. You had to decide to take that action, but you didn't decide in the sense that we normally think of that word. Something below that threshold made that decision and took that action.
Mm-hmm.
So the larger percentage of what goes on in our heads, or wherever that is, right, goes on, we are unconscious or unaware of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But and yet it's still a conscious process. The
Yeah.
interesting little paradox there.
Yeah. I mean, I believe that beyond that threshold is our genius.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that. Now, have you? I mean, I know you're running out of time.
Yeah.
We've got to probably wrap it up here pretty soon. But I wanted to just get your opinion on this because I just thought of it as we were going through this conversation. After 40 years and remote viewing being in the public mind for as much as it is, for how many people are aware of it, people are practicing it, doing. Do you think that as a collective, because more people are doing it, that we're getting better at it or more accurate at it, or is it getting easier collectively? Do you think because more people are doing it, like a 100th monkey kind of a thing? In your opinion, from what you've seen and all your training and being so involved.
By the way, it's over 50 years now. The first experiment was in June 1972.
50 years now.
50
Gee,
years.
don't be making me feel old here.
Yeah, we celebrated 40 years in 2002 here in Austin with the 2002 Remote Viewing Conference.
Man, make me feel old now.
By the way, I'd like to put in a plug for the Remote Viewing Conference this year
Please
in
do.
New Orleans. Yeah, folks, sign up. I'll talk to the camera here. We're always excited to have more folks at the Remote Viewing Conference, and the 2016 Remote Viewing Conference, New Orleans. Still, you can get there. There's still time.
What date?
23 to 25 September. So I don't know,
That's a couple of weeks away from now.
2 weeks, something like that, away from now. And we're always happy to have more folks because it makes it more fun.
You have an amazing panel of guests.
This is going to be a great
incredible
program.
topics.
And this one's actually, we've got more activities than we were having before. We have one thing I think I'm really looking forward to is a thing we call Sci Games.
What is that?
That's going to be a whole bunch of ESP related and remote viewing related games. We're going to do some ESP testing, sort of. I guess you could call it that, right? With we're going to actually use Zener cards, the old-fashioned thing.
Man.
But that's going to be fun. We have Zener cards. We're going to do a dowsing. I'm going to run a dowsing thing where we douse for an object, and we do a little bit of instruction, and then you get to try it. A lot of folks already know how, right? So they get to see how well they do, and then
that'll be fun in a group of people who are interested.
It could be a blast. Yeah. And then we're going to do. Let's see, there'll be a remote view off, right, where we'll have two teams and they'll jointly remote view a target, and then the one who does the best will have some independent judges. They get some kind of prize or something, I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
And we're going to do PK and REG, random event generator. We're going to try and influence that mentally, right?
Oh man, you guys are going to have a lot of fun.
Yeah, and then there's some psychokinesis games, kind of traditional ones, and some not so traditional that
Cool,
are
man.
going to be done as well. So that's going to be fun. But we've got two outbounders we're going to do, outbound remote viewing sessions we're going to do, and one of them is a transoceanic one. Transcontinental, essentially, right?
Yeah, very cool.
That's in honor of our keynote speaker, Marilyn Schlitz, who was one of the early adopters of remote viewing. And she's famous in noetic circles, right? In fact, she was the main character in one of Dan Brown's books, The Lost Symbol.
Oh, cool.
But one of her very first experiments was a transcontinental remote viewing between the U.S. and Italy. Validation of the target put-off stuff, so very important early on as a replication. So we're going to do one that's also transcontinental in her honor. And all kinds of stuff. I don't want to get into. I am going to teach a very basic workshop Friday morning because it looks like we're going to have a bunch of folks that don't really know a lot about remote viewing.
Yeah.
And so we decided I should give a little intro class before the conference actually starts. So
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah,
great idea.
People can come in. But yeah, so the website is rvconference.org.
rvconference.org. There's still time. Just sign up and go. It's only over across the border over here in Louisiana,
Yeah,
New Orleans.
Not far from Austin.
Not far from Austin, and it's going to be a great time.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, man, it's so great to have you in the home playing guitar, jamming out, some Johnny Cash.
I wish we'd had more time for that.
Next time, man, we'll have to
Yeah.
dedicate a little more time to
Yeah.
jamming, man. A little more time
That'd
jamming.
be cool.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. All right,
Awesome.
man.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.